The millionaire thought she was a maid, but she was the heiress who owned his world. Hello, everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let us return to our main characters. He had everything that people spent their lives chasing. Adrian Hale was the kind of man who could make headlines with a single move. His name carried weight in every boardroom, and his reputation was built on precision, control, and the kind of success that most people only dreamed of. Yet, behind the oceanfront walls of his vast estate, his world had become quiet, too quiet. The sea outside his window was the only thing that still moved freely. It roared and shifted, but inside those marble halls, time felt frozen. Adrian had learned to live surrounded by silence after betrayal taught him that trust could be a fatal luxury. Years ago, a business partner he considered family had destroyed not only his empire but also his ability to believe in anyone again. So when the new maid arrived one soft spring morning, Adrian did not even bother to ask her name. He just signed the approval papers from the agency and told the head housekeeper to handle the rest. Her name was Clara Wynne. She carried herself with a calm grace, dressed in the simple uniform that made her blend into the background of his immaculate home. She spoke politely, moved quietly, and never met his eyes for too long. Her presence was almost invisible almost. On her first day, Clara paused in front of a large portrait in the main hall. It showed Adrian's late parents, a reminder of the lineage that built the Hale fortune. The brushstrokes captured dignity, but the eyes in the painting seemed distant, much like Adrian himself. When he appeared at the top of the staircase, she immediately lowered her gaze. "You must be the new maid," he said, his tone as cold as the polished floor beneath her shoes. "Yes, sir," she answered softly. "Keep to your duties. This house runs on order, not conversation." "And yes, sir," she repeated, though her mind was far from submission, because Clara Wynne was not a maid. She was the only daughter of Edward Wynne, the late founder of Wynne Industries, once one of the biggest investors in the Hale Corporation. Her father's death 3 years ago had been labeled an accident. The merger between their companies had collapsed overnight, and Adrian Hale had disappeared from public view soon after. Clara had spent years piecing together rumors, news articles, and broken documents. Every thread led back to this man, the one who now stood before her, untouched by the ashes of her family's downfall. She had come here not for money, not for service, but for answers. At night, when the mansion lights dimmed, Clara would move through the hallways in silence, memorizing every corner. She studied the layout, the security cameras, even the schedule of deliveries. Her calm demeanor was not fear, it was calculation. But the first thing that surprised her was not what she discovered in the documents hidden in his study. It was the man himself. Adrian Hale was not what she expected. His face, though stern, carried the exhaustion of someone who had fought too many invisible battles. He treated his staff with distant respect, never cruelty, and his solitude seemed genuine. There were moments when she caught him standing by the large window overlooking the sea, his hands resting on the glass as if searching for something he could not name. The line between hatred and understanding began to blur, though she refused to admit it. One evening, while she was dusting the grand library, Adrian entered without warning. His presence filled the room like thunder. "Leave the reports on my desk when you are done," he said, not looking at her. "Yes, sir," she replied, turning toward the shelves. Her hand brushed against a leather-bound folder and a familiar signature caught her eye. Edward Wynne. Her heart stopped. She quickly slid the folder behind other books, just as he turned toward her. "Is something wrong?" he asked. She forced a small smile. "Just dust, sir." He studied her face for a second longer than usual. Then he nodded, took the papers, and left. When the door closed, Clara exhaled slowly. The name on that folder confirmed what she already knew. Her father and Adrian had once been partners, and something had torn them apart. She needed to find out what. Later that night, she stepped out to the terrace, the salty wind brushing her face. From a distance, she could see Adrian in his study, the faint golden light casting a shadow across his expression. He looked powerful, but also profoundly alone. "Did you really destroy him, Adrian Hale?" she whispered to herself. "Or were you betrayed too?" The waves crashed against the rocks below, answering her with their endless rhythm. In that moment, under the coastal moonlight, two souls, one broken by betrayal, the other driven by revenge, stood unknowingly on the same path. A path that would lead them from lies to truth, from disguise to love, and from despair to healing. The next morning, the mansion awoke to the quiet hum of rain. The sea was restless, the sky low and heavy, and the air carried that scent of salt and storm that Adrian Hale had learned to love. It reminded him of control, something he could not lose to anyone ever again. He stood by the window in his tailored gray suit, sipping coffee that had already gone cold, watching the world through the glass like an outsider looking in. Behind him, Clara Wynne moved silently across the marble floor, collecting files and rearranging the study exactly the way he preferred. Her movements were precise, her presence invisible. But today, something about her rhythm was different. Her pulse raced with every folder she touched, especially when her hand brushed against the leather one marked with her father's initials. Adrian noticed her hesitation. "You are unusually quiet today," he said, his voice even but observant. She straightened. "Just focusing on my work, sir." "Good," he replied, glancing briefly in her direction. "In this house, focus is the most valuable skill." He meant it as a statement of control. But to Clara, it sounded like a warning. When he left for a meeting downtown, Clara finally dared to open the folder. Inside, she found letters, contracts signed by both Adrian Hale and Edward Wynne. They spoke of a merger that was supposed to change the future of both companies. But the final pages were missing, ripped out deliberately. She felt a chill travel through her spine. What had been hidden so carefully that someone destroyed the evidence? She folded the papers back and placed the folder exactly where it was, memorizing every line she had read. Then she returned to her room in the servants' quarters, closed the door, and allowed herself a single moment to breathe. The rain outside grew heavier, as if echoing the storm inside her chest. Later that afternoon, Adrian returned earlier than expected. The rain had ruined his schedule, and the board meeting had been postponed. When he entered the library, he found Clara there, organizing books she had already arranged earlier that morning. "You do not have to work twice on the same task," he said, setting his coat aside. She turned, startled but composed. "I find comfort in order," she replied softly. He paused, his expression unreadable. "Comfort is dangerous. It makes people forget how quickly life can collapse." The words cut through the room like glass. Clara wanted to respond, but stopped herself. He was not speaking only about her. He was speaking about his own ghosts. Adrian walked to the window and looked out at the gray horizon. "People think success makes you untouchable," he said quietly. "They do not see what it costs to keep standing when everyone else walks away." Oh. For the first time, Clara saw the man beneath the legend, the weariness in his eyes, the weight of silence on his shoulders. Something in her heart shifted. This was not the ruthless millionaire she had imagined. This was a man who had been left behind by truth, just as she had. That evening, when the storm reached its peak, a power surge knocked out half the lights in the mansion. Adrian was still in his study, surrounded by open files, when the breaker tripped again. Clara entered the room holding a small lantern. The warm glow flickered against the rain-streaked windows. "You should rest, sir," she said softly. "It is late." He looked up, surprised by her concern. "Rest is for those who have nothing to fix," he answered. She smiled faintly. "And yet, even broken things need a pause before they can be repaired." Her words lingered in the air. Adrian studied her for a long moment, unable to look away. There was something unsettlingly familiar in her voice, an understanding he had not felt in years. When the lights finally returned, she set the lantern down and began to leave, but his voice stopped her at the door. "Clara," he said quietly, "do you believe people deserve second chances?" She froze. "Only if they are brave enough to face the truth." He nodded slowly. "Then perhaps neither of us has earned one yet." She turned and walked away, her heart pounding. He could not possibly know who she was, but somehow his words struck too close. Later that night, Clara sat by the small window in her room, staring into the storm. She unfolded the copy she had made of her father's last letter and read it again. The ink was faded, the paper creased, but one sentence burned brighter than ever. "If one day you must face him, do so not with hate, but with courage." Courage. That was what she needed now. Downstairs, Adrian poured himself a drink. The storm outside was calming, but his mind was not. He could not stop thinking about the maid who looked at him as if she could see straight through his walls. He did not know her secret. She did not know his truth. But destiny had already placed them in the same storm, two broken souls unknowingly carrying the same wound, about to find healing in the most unexpected way. The following week began with an unexpected call that changed everything. Adrian Hale was summoned to the city for an urgent board meeting after an old scandal suddenly resurfaced in the press. Headlines accused him of manipulating the Wynn merger years ago, exactly the deal that had destroyed Claire's father. He read the articles in silence, jaw tight, eyes dark with controlled fury. His assistant, nervous, said quietly, "Sir, they are demanding a public statement. The investors want reassurance that you are still stable." Adrian closed the tablet. "Stability is not declared," he said coldly. "It is proven." That same afternoon, he returned to the mansion earlier than usual. The media outside the gate had begun circling like vultures. He needed a plan, something that would silence the noise before it consumed his company again. And fate, as always, was waiting in the quietest corner of his life. When Adrian entered the library, he found Clara standing near the window, folding clean curtains. Her hair had loosened slightly from the rain, soft strands framing her face. For a brief second, she looked less like a maid and more like someone from another world, calm, steady, and dignified. "Clara," he said, his tone unreadable, "do you read the news?" She hesitated. "Sometimes, sir." "Then you already know what they are saying about me." She turned to face him. "Yes, sir. But words are cheap. Truth is not." He studied her expression. She was the first person in months who did not flinch when his name came up with scandal. It stirred something in him, something dangerous, something human. "Come with me," he said abruptly. He led her to his office, where the city skyline was glowing through the rain. On his desk lay a stack of files and a single piece of paper bearing legal seals. "I am offering you a contract," he said, voice low but firm. "I need a public marriage, temporary, legal, and purely strategic. It will silence the investors and buy me time to rebuild the company. You will live here as my wife for 6 months. You will be compensated generously. When the time is over, you are free to leave." Clara stared at him, stunned. "A marriage?" "Yes." His tone was steady, almost emotionless. "On paper only. No obligations, no expectations. Just a signature." Her heart pounded. A fake marriage to the very man she had come to expose. Fate could not have written a crueler twist. Yet, deep down, another thought whispered, this could be her way closer to the truth. "Why me?" she asked quietly. "Because you are invisible," he replied. "You do your work without gossip, without curiosity. The press will not see you coming. And you are the only one in this house I can trust not to sell my secrets." His words cut through her confusion. The irony almost made her tremble. If only he knew how wrong he was about trust. She took a slow breath. "What if someone finds out?" "Then it becomes real," he said calmly. The silence between them thickened. Rain tapped softly against the window. Clara looked at him, the man the world saw as ruthless, and for a fleeting second, she saw the exhaustion in his eyes. Maybe this was not just about business. Maybe this was about redemption. "Very well," she said at last. "If this contract helps you rebuild what you have lost, then I accept." Adrian nodded once, relief hidden behind composure. "We sign tomorrow morning." When he left the room, Clara sat down slowly, her thoughts spinning. She had come to this mansion to uncover secrets, but now she was about to become one herself. That night, she pulled out her father's last letter once more. The ink was fading, but the lines she had memorized burned brighter than ever. "If something happens to me, trust that Adrian meant no harm." Could that be true? Could the man who had just asked her to become his wife fake or not really be innocent? In his study, Adrian stared at the same rain she did. He thought about her calmness, her quiet strength, and how easily she had agreed. Something about it unsettled him. Most people would have refused immediately. Who exactly was Clara Wynn? Outside, the storm began to fade, but inside both hearts, something new began to stir. The line between pretense and truth was starting to blur, and neither of them could see where it would lead. Because sometimes, the most dangerous contracts are not written on paper, they are written in trust, in silence, and in the moments when two broken souls dare to believe in each other. The next morning came quietly, with sunlight cutting through the mist above the ocean. The air smelled of salt and coffee, and yet the entire mansion seemed to hold its breath. Clara stood in the study wearing a simple beige dress that Adrian's assistant had delivered for her. On the table before them sat the marriage contract, 2 copies, 2 pens, and 1 promise neither of them truly understood. Adrian Hale was calm, composed as always. But inside, his thoughts were sharper than ever. He had built empires on logic, but what he was about to do defied every rule he had lived by. "Once you sign," he said evenly, "you will become Mrs. Hale in every legal sense. Our staff, our investors, and the press will believe it. Are you sure you understand what this means?" Clara nodded. "I understand." "Good." He slid the papers toward her. "Then sign here." Her hand trembled only slightly as the pen touched the page. When she finished, he added his signature beside hers, decisive, deliberate, final. For the first time since her father's death, Clara felt the ground shift beneath her. The contract was meant to be business, but the moment their signatures touched the same paper, something deeper took root, something neither of them could name. After the signing, a photographer from a trusted magazine arrived to capture their private ceremony. The arrangement was simple. Adrian in a tailored black suit, Clara in a modest ivory dress. There were no flowers, no vows, only the sound of the ocean wind sweeping through the terrace as the camera clicked. When the photographer left, silence returned. "You played your part well," Adrian said, removing his tie. "So did you," she replied softly. He looked at her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "I did not expect you to look believable." She tilted her head slightly. "Believable enough for the world, or believable for you?" He did not answer. Instead, he turned toward the window, his reflection merging with the horizon beyond. For reasons he could not explain, her presence made the silence feel heavier, not emptier. Days turned into weeks, and the illusion deepened. The news reported their marriage as a quiet, unexpected union that restored confidence among investors. The Hale Corporation shares began to climb again, but inside the mansion, something far less predictable was unfolding. Clara learned that Adrian was not the unfeeling man he pretended to be. He worked late into the night, reviewing reports by hand, his focus relentless. Yet, every morning, he still found time to check that the staff were paid fairly, and that the local orphanage his parents had funded continued to receive donations. He lived with discipline, but he carried his grief like armor. One evening, Clara found him outside by the cliffs, where the waves crashed violently below. The air was cold, the wind heavy with sea spray. "You should not stand this close to the edge," she said quietly. He turned slightly, his gaze distant. "Sometimes, I need to remind myself that I can still feel fear." "You think fear makes you alive?" she asked. "It reminds me that I have not turned into stone." She stepped closer, her voice softer. "Maybe it also means you still have something left to lose." Adrian looked at her, then really looked. The wind carried strands of her hair across her face, and for a moment the world seemed suspended between confession and restraint. "You are not like anyone I have met," he said finally. "I take that as a compliment," she replied, her lips curving faintly. Later that night, when Claire returned to her room, her thoughts refused to settle. She had expected this marriage to be a transaction, a bridge to the truth about her father. But the more time she spent near Adrian, the more the lines blurred between mission and emotion. Still, the mystery of what had destroyed her family remained. The missing pages from the contract, the unexplained transfer of shares, someone had hidden the truth carefully, and she was determined to find it. Meanwhile, Adrian began to notice the smallest details about her, the way she avoided mirrors, how she always paused before speaking, as if measuring every word. He told himself it was curiosity, nothing more. Yet, he found his gaze following her down the hall, drawn to her presence like gravity itself. One night, during a charity dinner, he caught himself defending her when a guest questioned their sudden marriage. "Clara has brought peace to my home," he said, his voice steady but sincere. And in that instant, even he realized it was no longer entirely an act. Back at the mansion, Clara stood on the balcony, looking out at the restless waves. Somewhere deep inside, guilt stirred. She had come here under false pretenses, but Adrian's quiet kindness was dismantling her anger piece by piece. Perhaps this was how walls fell, not with noise, but with silence and small acts of humanity. Because love, she realized, does not always announce itself. Sometimes it slips quietly through the cracks of a lie and teaches two broken souls how to feel again. The summer evening fell quietly over the Hale estate. The sound of the ocean blended with the whisper of the wind, and the house that once felt cold had begun to breathe with a new kind of life. The staff smiled more often. The tension that used to hang in every corner seemed to fade, replaced by something gentler, something that began the day Clara Wynne signed her name beside Adrian Hale's. To the world, they were a married couple, graceful, private, enviable. To each other, they were still strangers living under one roof, bound by a lie neither dared to break. But that lie was starting to feel too real. That night, Adrian worked late in his study. The clock showed almost midnight. Documents were spread across the desk, but his mind was elsewhere, on the sound of Clara's voice at dinner, on the way she had laughed softly at one of his dry remarks. It had been so long since laughter lived inside these walls. He told himself it meant nothing, yet the thought lingered. Outside the door, Clara walked through the hallway carrying a tray of tea. She had learned his routine by heart. He never asked for it, but she brought it anyway, using it as an excuse to check if he was resting. She knocked once. "Come in," his voice said from inside. The fire burned low in the fireplace, casting soft light across the room. He looked up when she entered. "You should be asleep," he said. "I could say the same to you, sir." He gave a faint smile. "Old habits. Sleep and I have never agreed." She placed the tray on the side table. Her gaze wandered over the piles of reports until it caught something that made her freeze, a sealed envelope marked confidential Wynne Holdings. Her heartbeat quickened. She remembered the folder she had found weeks ago, the missing pages, her father's name. This could be the link she had been searching for. "Is something wrong?" Adrian asked, noticing the sudden stillness in her face. She forced a calm smile. "No, nothing at all." He nodded slowly, returning to his papers. Clara turned to leave, but the temptation was unbearable. When he looked away to answer his phone, she slipped the envelope into the pocket of her cardigan, her hands trembling. She told herself she would only look at it just to know the truth. Hours later, when the house fell silent, Clara sat in her room under the dim glow of a lamp. With careful fingers, she opened the envelope. Inside were financial statements, transaction records, and one letter signed by her father. It confirmed her worst fear. The betrayal that destroyed Wynne Holdings had come from within, not from Adrian. Someone else had manipulated both sides for profit. Tears welled in her eyes. Everything she had believed, everything that fueled her anger, was suddenly uncertain. She barely had time to think before she heard footsteps in the hallway. The door opened, and Adrian stood there, holding the empty envelope she had tried to return unnoticed. "Looking for this?" he asked quietly. Her breath caught. He stepped closer. "You went through my files." His voice was calm, too calm. "Tell me why, Clara." She swallowed hard, the truth pressing against her lips. "Because I had to know," she said finally. "I had to know what really happened to my father." The room fell silent except for the pounding of her heart. Adrian's eyes darkened, not with anger, but with realization. "Edward Wynne," he said slowly. "You are his daughter." She could not hide anymore. "Yes." He turned away, pacing toward the window. For years, he had carried guilt over the merger, believing it had destroyed a good man. To learn that her father's daughter had been living in his home, pretending to be his wife, was almost too much to comprehend. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, strained. "You came here to punish me." "No," she whispered. "I came here for the truth. I thought you were the one who ruined him, but I was wrong." Adrian turned back to her, his expression torn between anger and sorrow. "And what now? You think the truth will save either of us?" She shook her head, tears falling freely. "No, but lies have already destroyed too much." For a moment, neither spoke. The wind outside howled, and thunder rolled across the coast. Then Adrian said quietly, "Leave the documents. We will talk in the morning." She placed them on the table, her hands trembling. "I am sorry, Adrian," she whispered before walking past him. But as she reached the door, his voice stopped her. "Clara." She turned. He met her eyes, and for the first time, his voice softened. "Your father was the only man who ever believed I could be more than a name on a fortune. Whatever destroyed him, I swear, it was not me." Her throat tightened. "I know," she said. "Now I finally know." Lightning flashed outside, filling the room with white light. Two people, once bound by suspicion, now stood at the edge of something far more fragile: trust. But fate was not finished with them yet, because in stories like theirs, truth never comes without consequence. The morning after that storm of revelations, the mansion felt heavier than ever. The silence between Adrian and Clara was not born of anger, but of exhaustion, two hearts trying to make sense of a truth that had shattered the ground beneath them. Adrian had not slept. He had stayed awake in his study, staring at the same letter from Edward Wynne that Clara had discovered. His mind replayed her confession again and again. "I thought you were the one who ruined him, but I was wrong." And it should have brought relief, but instead it stirred something far more dangerous: a need for justice. At dawn, Adrian drove to the city headquarters of Hale Corporation. The building, glass and steel, reflected the pale light of morning. His longtime financial advisor, Elias Ward, was already waiting inside. Adrian had known him for years: charming, loyal, efficient, or so he had believed. "I need you to pull every document related to the Wynn merger," Adrian ordered, voice low but firm. "Every transfer, every communication, even the ones archived before the investigation." Elias hesitated, then smiled carefully. "That was nearly 3 years ago, Adrian. Digging that up now will only feed the rumors again." "I did not ask for your opinion," Adrian said sharply. "Just bring me the files." For the first time, he noticed something in Elias's expression, a flicker of discomfort, quickly hidden behind a polite nod. Adrian's instincts tightened. Meanwhile, back at the mansion, Clara stood by the window watching the sea turn silver under the morning light. Her heart was torn between guilt and gratitude. She had come into Adrian's world under false pretenses, but now she found herself wanting to protect him. She had seen the truth with her own eyes: the transfers, the forged signatures, and one name appeared again and again: Elias Ward. That afternoon, Adrian returned, his face unreadable. He found Clara in the library, the very room where she had once lied to him. "I went through the old accounts," he said quietly. "Someone inside my company manipulated both of our families. The funds from the merger were rerouted before they reached the Wynn Trust." Clara met his gaze. "Elias Ward." He froze. "How do you know that name?" "I saw it in the documents last night," she said. "My father trusted him. He was the one who arranged the final deal before everything collapsed." "Oh," Adrian's jaw tightened. "He was my advisor, the one I trusted most." The truth struck him like a wave: sharp, cold, undeniable. Elias had not only betrayed Edward Wynne, but had used both of their names to enrich himself. Adrian turned away, his voice steady but filled with quiet rage. "He took everything from both of us, Clara, and we helped him do it." Clara stepped forward. "Then let us finish what he started, together." Her words caught him off guard. For years, Adrian had faced battles alone, trusting no one. Yet now, standing before him was the daughter of the man whose loss had haunted him, and she was offering her trust. Later that night, Adrian went to confront Elias. The man who had once stood beside him at every board meeting now smiled like nothing was wrong. "I should have known it was you," Adrian said coldly. "You played both sides until there was nothing left but ashes." Elias's smirk did not fade. "It was never personal, Adrian. It was survival. You built an empire on numbers. I simply learned to count faster." Adrian clenched his fist. "You destroyed a man's legacy, and you used my name to do it." Elias stepped closer, his tone darker now. "And you, my friend, built your guilt around it. That is what made you weak." The words cut deep, but Adrian did not respond. He had learned that revenge spoken in anger loses its power. He turned and walked away, his silence louder than any threat. When he returned home, Clara was waiting in the study, a folder in her hands. "I found proof," she said. "Enough to expose everything Elias has done. He cannot hide anymore." Adrian looked at her, his expression softening for the first time that day. "You could have walked away, Clara. You had every reason to." Her voice trembled. "So did you, but you did not." And for a long moment they stood there, two people who had been enemies, now united by the same wound and the same hope for redemption. Outside, the waves crashed against the rocks, as if echoing their silent vow. The truth was out, but justice always comes with a cost, and both of them were about to learn what that cost would be. Because in the shadows of every betrayal, love either breaks or becomes the only thing worth saving. The next days passed like a quiet storm. The air around the Hale estate was tense yet fragile, as if the walls themselves knew that the truth was close to breaking free. Adrian Hale and Clara Wynn had gathered every piece of evidence against Elias Ward financial records, forged contracts, and letters that connected him to the collapse of both the Hale and Wynn empires. But truth, once uncovered, rarely stays silent. By morning, the press had caught wind of an anonymous leak. Headlines screamed about fraud, corruption, and betrayal within the Hale Corporation. Reporters crowded the gates, cameras flashing, demanding answers. Inside, Adrian stood by the window, phone in hand, his jaw set in determination. Elias must have sensed it, he said, turning toward Clara. He knows we are exposing him. Clara's heart pounded. Then what will he do? Anything, Adrian replied. He has nothing left to lose. At that moment, her eyes caught something that made her freeze a car parked near the edge of the property. Headlights dimmed. Before she could speak, Adrian's security team confirmed it. Elias Ward had entered the estate grounds with 2 unknown men. Stay here, Adrian said sharply. No, Clara protested. If this is about my father, then I have a right to be here. Adrian looked at her, torn between anger and fear. You are not a soldier, Clara. You do not understand what this man is capable of. I understand loss, she whispered, and I am done running from it. The confrontation came in the great hall, beneath the towering chandelier that once symbolized the Hale family's pride. Elias stood there, his confidence barely hiding the desperation in his eyes. So this is what it comes to, Elias said coolly. The master of control reduced to a man protecting a maid with too many questions. Clara stepped forward. I am not a maid, Mr. Ward. Her voice was steady. I am Clara Wynn, daughter of the man you betrayed. Elias froze, the color draining from his face. Edward's daughter, he muttered. Of course. You are just like him, naive enough to believe in honor. Adrian moved between them, his tone hard as steel. You used us both. You turned 2 families into enemies just so you could build your own fortune. It ends tonight. Elias laughed bitterly. You think justice will save you? The world does not care who is guilty. It only remembers who falls first. He reached into his coat, pulling out a small flash drive. Every copy of your company's transactions is here. 1 leak, and you both lose everything. Adrian took a step closer. Then leak it. I have nothing left to hide. Elias hesitated just long enough for Clara to speak. That is where you are wrong, Elias. Because I already sent the evidence to the authorities this morning. And, for the first time, fear flickered in his eyes. You what? You taught me something, she said. That truth means nothing unless someone is brave enough to speak it. Within minutes, the sound of sirens echoed in the distance. Elias realized it was over. The guards entered, and for the first time in years, Adrian felt the weight of guilt lift from his shoulders. But victory came with a price. As the officers escorted Elias away, Adrian turned to Clara. You should have told me what you planned. I could not risk you stopping me, she said. It had to be done. He stared at her, emotion rising in his voice. Do you think I would have stopped you from saving what was left of your father's name? Clara, I would have stood beside you. Tears welled in her eyes. I wanted to believe that. But I was afraid. He stepped closer, his voice gentler now. Afraid of me? Afraid of what I was feeling, she whispered, because somewhere along this lie, I stopped pretending. The confession hung between them like fragile glass. Adrian's hand reached for hers, trembling slightly. You think you were the only one? She looked up, eyes shining. Then why does it hurt so much to tell the truth? Because the truth, he said softly, is what love has been trying to say all along. Outside, dawn broke over the ocean. The storm had passed, leaving the air clean and still. Inside the mansion, 2 people who had started as enemies now stood in the quiet aftermath of truth, raw, exposed, and free. Yet freedom always carries a shadow, for while justice had been served, fate was not done testing them. Some debts are not paid in money, but in the moments when the heart must choose between forgiveness and fear. And for Adrian Hale and Clara Wynn, that choice was coming sooner than either of them expected. The night after Elias Ward's arrest, the ocean winds turned cold again. The world outside celebrated the scandal's exposure, but inside the Hale estate, neither Adrian nor Clara could find peace. The truth had freed them from lies, yet it left behind something heavier: grief for what had been lost and fear for what might come next. For days, reporters flooded the gates. Cameras flashed, headlines spread, and the press painted their story as a tale of revenge and scandal. Adrian ignored it all. He focused on rebuilding his company's integrity, determined to honor the Wynn name as much as his own. But fate was not done with them. One evening, as the sun sank behind the cliffs, Adrian sat in his study, reviewing documents with tired eyes. The mansion had grown quiet again, too quiet. Clara had gone to the archive room to store evidence for the authorities. The scent of sea salt drifted in through the open window. Then, from somewhere deep within the house, came the faint crack of breaking glass. "Clara?" he called. No answer. A moment later, the fire alarm screamed. Thick smoke began to rise from the east wing. Adrian rushed out of his office, heart pounding. Flames licked the walls of the corridor, turning the air into choking heat. "Clara!" he shouted again. Through the haze, he heard her voice calling his name. She was trapped inside the archive room, the fire blocking her path. Without hesitation, Adrian covered his mouth with his sleeve and forced his way through the smoke. The floor burned beneath his shoes and the air tasted like ash. But all he could think about was reaching her. When he finally found her, she was coughing near the door, trying to shield the last box of documents from the fire. "Leave it," he said hoarsely, grabbing her arm. "These are the only originals," she gasped. "If they burn, everything your company and my father stood for will vanish." "Oh." Adrian looked at the flames consuming the shelves, then at her pale face streaked with soot. "Then let it vanish," he said firmly. "I am not losing you, Clara." He pulled her close, wrapping his jacket around her shoulders. Together, they stumbled through the smoke, the fire closing in around them. The air roared like thunder. For a terrifying moment, the ceiling above them cracked, raining sparks. Adrian threw himself over her, shielding her from the falling debris. Outside, the mansion staff had already called the fire department. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Adrian carried Clara out into the cold night air, his lungs burning, his shirt blackened with ash. He laid her gently on the grass near the driveway, the firelight reflecting in her half-open eyes. "Clara, stay with me," he pleaded. "Do you hear me? Stay with me." She coughed weakly, whispering, "You risked everything for me." He shook his head, holding her hand tightly. "You were everything worth risking for." The paramedics arrived moments later, pulling her onto a stretcher. Adrian stayed by her side, refusing to leave even when they told him to step back. His hand never left hers as the ambulance doors closed. Hours later, in the hospital, Adrian sat beside her bed. The smell of antiseptic and salt still clung to him. Clara lay motionless, her skin pale against the white sheets. Machines beeped softly, counting each fragile second. He leaned forward, his voice breaking. "I spent years building walls so no one could hurt me again. Then you walked into my house, and suddenly the silence I loved felt unbearable. You came here to destroy me, Clara, but instead, you saved me." A single tear slipped down his cheek and fell onto her hand. He whispered, "Please, wake up. I never told you that I love you." The clock ticked on. The first light of morning crept through the blinds. Then, as if guided by something unseen, Clara's fingers moved. Her voice came out soft, barely audible. "You just did." Adrian froze. Then, slowly, her eyes opened, reflecting the same golden morning light he had not noticed in years. "You kept your promise," she murmured weakly. "You did not let go." He smiled through tears, pressing her hand against his heart. "Never again." Outside the window, the dawn painted the sea in gold and blue, the same colors of the new life waiting for them. The fire had taken part of the past, but in its ashes, something far greater had been reborn. Because sometimes miracles do not come in grand gestures or divine signs. Sometimes they arrive quietly in the moment when two wounded hearts finally stop running from the truth. The weeks after the fire felt like waking from a long storm. The Hale mansion had been repaired slowly, piece by piece, but the people within it were no longer the same. Adrian Hale and Clara Wynn had both seen how fragile life could be, how easily everything built on pride and pain could disappear in a single spark. Clara's recovery was steady. The doctor said it was a miracle that she survived the smoke and the flames. Adrian visited her every day, refusing to leave her side even when the doctors insisted he rest. Each time she opened her eyes, she found him there quiet, patient, holding her hand like it was the only thing anchoring him to the world. When she was finally well enough to return home, Adrian drove her back to the estate himself. The once charred walls were now freshly painted, but the scent of smoke still lingered faintly, like a reminder of everything they had endured. "You rebuilt it," she said softly as they walked through the hall. I rebuilt what I could, he replied. The rest, I am still learning how to fix. For the first time, there was no distance in his voice. Over the following days, the world outside slowly moved on from their story. The headlines shifted to other scandals, other names. The Hale and Wynn foundations, once torn apart, had now joined under a single cause, the Hale Wynn Foundation for Hope, dedicated to restoring trust and opportunity for families who had lost everything to betrayal and greed. At the launch ceremony, Adrian stood before the cameras, but his words were not rehearsed, not cold, not corporate. Money can build walls, he said, his voice calm but deep, but it cannot rebuild what betrayal destroys. Only truth can do that. And sometimes, truth arrives not as punishment but as grace. He looked toward Clara, standing quietly at the edge of the stage, her eyes shining with pride. This foundation is not about redemption for me. It is about continuing what Edward Wynn began, and about honoring the person who taught me to believe again. End of. The room erupted in applause, but for Adrian, the only sound that mattered was the soft breath Clara took when she smiled at him. That night, after the event ended, the two of them walked along the cliffs where everything had begun, the same cliffs, where once he had stood alone, believing that fear was the only proof of life. The sea was calm now, painted gold by the setting Sunday. I used to think my father's world ended when he died, Clara said quietly, but maybe he left something behind after all. Adrian looked at her gently. He left courage, in you. She turned toward him. And what about you, Adrian? What did you find after losing everything? He paused, his gaze steady. You! There was no grand gesture, no perfect music, just the wind brushing against them and the ocean whispering below. Adrian reached for her hand. She did not pull away. I once told myself that love was weakness, he said. That trusting someone meant giving them the power to destroy you. But you... He stopped, his voice softening. You taught me that love is not surrender. It is rebuilding, even after everything burns. Clara's eyes filled with quiet tears. Then let us rebuild together. The sun dipped lower, its reflection shimmering across the water like 1,000 tiny promises. For the first time, Adrian felt something close to peace, not the hollow kind that came from control, but the kind that came from forgiveness. The world that had once belonged to him now felt different. It was no longer built from stone and fear, but from trust, second chances, and a woman who had walked into his house as a stranger and stayed long enough to heal it. He smiled faintly. You came here to uncover the truth, Clara Wynn, but in the end, you became the truth I was searching for. Sifted. She smiled back, her voice barely above a whisper. And you, Adrian Hale, became the home I never thought I would find. The ocean wind carried their laughter into the twilight, blending with the sound of the waves below. Because in the end, it was never about the contracts, the lies, or the fortune. It was about two broken hearts finding the courage to forgive, to rebuild, and to love again. And as the first stars appeared over the horizon, one truth remained. The millionaire thought she was a maid, but she was the heiress who owned his world.